Music theory with OneNote. Scale degree chords versus modal chords. This time building chords off the minor modal points, creating minor chords, in other words, from the Aeolian mode, the Phrygian mode, the Dorian mode, and we're even throwing in the Locrian mode, which is kind of a minor chord, minor mode, but it also has that flat 5. So get ready and some coffee, because although we're just playing with one note, it's a beautiful note. You're not required to, but if you have access to it and would like to follow along, we're currently in the OneNote file of Modal Node System, MNS Presentation 1364, OneNote, Scale Degree Chords versus Modal Chords, Minor Mode Chords, list of presentations on the right, which we plan on adding plenty more to shortly. Also noting, in this OneNote presentation, we'll spend our time on music theory, but we have another similarly numbered and named presentation where we build these tables in Excel, practicing music, Excel, and just table visualization skills all at the same time. First, a quick recap of our overall objective, that being to create an optimal system for both the creation and the demonstration, the presentation of chords, something we don't typically have in our current system. For example, if you were to look up a nice table that shows us all the typical chords that can be created from the notes in a typical collection of notes, such as those 7-note collections around the key of C major, you might get a table that looks something like this, which is nice and tidy, but it doesn't really tell you exactly what you need, because it doesn't tell you which of these types of constructions should be applied to each of the points within your 7-note collection. For example, if I say I have a major type of chord, you might call that a C major, but the C major doesn't really tell you if it's an Ionian node or if it's going to be a Mixolydian mode or a Lydian mode. If you say it's a C major 7, it kind of narrows it down if you know your intervals, but then it's still not very specific as to which note or which point you should be applying that chord to. This time we're going to go into the minor mode construction. You have the similar problem. If I just say it's a minor chord, then I say it's an A minor, that doesn't really tell me where I am on the fretboard. Does that mean it's going to be a Dorian chord, an Aeolian chord, and so on? You might say, well, you have to say the note. That's true. You could say the note, but still, if you say the note, it's not specific as to the shape that's around that one. So let's look at the fretboard to see that in more detail and think about how we can go about this a little bit more optimally, at least creating a chord chart that would be more specific, even if we use the same naming convention, or possibly think of the chords in a different naming convention, which is tied not to the note points, but rather to the relative points. So here's a fretboard which has 2 sides to each of the frets. We're still looking at the collection of notes around the key of C, so 7-note collection of the C major. But now we have the second half, which is giving us the distance. This fretboard, by the way, being optimal for basically analyzing your chords if you're doing so on a guitar. Now let's say that you know all of these points from a relative position standpoint. Then what I'd like to know from a chord standpoint is, on that node, what type of chord do I build from it? Is it going to be you could say, well, it's going to be a major chord, but more specifically, you could say it's an Ionian chord. Why is that better? Because then when you get to the 7, you know it's going to be a major 7 and not a minor 7, right? And then if I went from the Ionian node and I go up to the Dorian node, then I have changed the second side of this to now show the relative position or intervals from the Dorian node. And so when I build a chord here, again, what I want to know is what kind of chord can I build? You could say, well, it'd be a minor chord because it's a Dorian is a minor point. But I really want to know more detail than that, because the Dorian doesn't have all the same intervals when I get a more complex chord than just a minor chord or an Aeolian chord. So what I want to know is the chord that's built from this specific point. Beyond that, you could say I could call this a D chord. If I call it a D, you run into the same problems that we have seen in the past, that being it's not easily transposable. I want to name all the points as relative point positions, such as the Nashville number system does, but I want to do it more specifically to everything, to chords and to the relative positions. Why? Because then everything is maneuverable. So in other words, if I move this same collection of notes from the key of C to the 7-note collection around the D, then all of the names that are the note names will change. And therefore, I'd have to memorize what are going to be the notes that are going to be assigned to major and minor chord construction. But if I look at the relative position, as is done with the Nashville number system, the 1-4-5, which is the Ionian, Lydian, Mixolydian, will be major chord constructions. And beyond that, if I know them as a 1-4-5 that are different from each other, the Mixolydian has different intervals. In other words, it has a minor 7, for example, than the Ionian. Then I can know exactly where I am and what I should be building from that point. Plus, in the current system, what happens oftentimes is if I'm in a collection of notes around the key of C and then I make the tonic something different, or every time I build a chord within the same song, then they basically want to shift our naming convention. So if I build a chord off of the Lydian, now I want to make that the 1. They want to make that the 1 from a scale degree standpoint, which messes up the whole naming convention, because then from a Nashville number system, the 1-4-5 is no longer the majors. That's why the Nashville number system says, no, we're not going to do that. But it's actually, and which is actually the better thing to do, right? It would be better to say, no, this is the Lydian node. I'm going to build a chord off of the Lydian node. I don't need to rename it in order to do that. So those are the things, those are the benefits that we want to kind of think about. However, we do want to look at the current naming construction as well, and possibly just put those chords into a bucket, something like this, so that if you use the normal naming convention, you could say this first bucket is the Ionians. So they're all going to be major if you build off of the Ionian. So any of the 7-note collection, you can say this is going to be the chords that you will typically build from it as you add a 3-note chord up to a 7-note chord. If you're in the Lydian, then you have this bucket. So you have the bucket over here, but then they had to dump these two on the side, as we saw last time. If you have the Mixolydian, then you've got this bucket. You have the major up top, but then they had to move everything over to the 7s, because in the Mixolydian, it's the 7 that has a minor 7 versus the major 7. We're now going to continue that process with the Aeolian and break out how can we think about the Aeolian chords. So remember our general idea. Here's our notes in the musical alphabet. Here's the notes and letters. We have then looked at the relative positions, which are a formula for the C major: whole, whole, half, whole, 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 half. Brings us back home. That gives us a 7-note collection, which I can then look at simply relative positions by naming the nodal points, so that Nashville number system 1 through 7 can be applied to all 12 collections of 7 notes. We're then going to look at our interval layout so that we can map out the intervals as we build our chords, thinking of our chords as distances from the root being one way that we can construct our chords. All right, so let's start with the Aeolian. Aeolian. Okay, we're gonna start this one out. Don't get started with the Aeolian thing again. I like saying Aeolian. Okay, so if it's an Aeolian, a 3-note chord, that would be an A minor chord. But notice if I call it conventionally an A minor, it doesn't really tell me that it's an Aeolian. It doesn't tell me I'm building it off of the Aeolian note, because I could build an A minor also off of the Dorian and the Phrygian. So it would be nice to be more specific, and it would be nice to remove the A, because I'd like to write all my music in relative position. Why? Because then you can transpose it all the way across the fretboard to all 12 collections of 7 notes. See, this is particularly important if you were doing this by ear. If you were writing music by ear, you'd like to write it in all relative positions, so that then you can move it up and back through all of the 12 collections of 7 notes and test it to your ear. That which is not currently what we're doing, right? We're forcing people to write it. So it'd be better then to say, let's just call it a 3-note Aeolian chord, which would be a 3-note Aeolian. that means just like the minor chord, we're just going to take every other note, which would be a 6 from a Nashville number system, then a 1, then a 3, because it's 6 plus 2 goes to 7, and then around the horn to 1, and then 1 plus 2 is 3. In other words, we can define it very specifically as an Aeolian, Ionian, Phrygian chord. That's how you build it. You hold those three down on the guitar: Aeolian, Ionian, and the Phrygian nodes. We can also name it by the point and the distance from that point. So you could call it an Aeolian A2 if you want to express that the A is the note that you're on and that it's the Aeolian. But that's redundant if we already know the collection of notes. So the convention that is in the Nashville number system, which I think is a good one, is to say, hey, look, I'm going to name the 7-note collections based on the Ionian node, meaning I'm going to use the standard major scale formula to tell you what collection of 7 notes we're in, and then I'm going to tell you which of those notes are going to be the tonic. You could, however, say, look, I'm in the collection of notes for the Aeolian, or I'm playing in a minor key. Totally can do that, but and minor might not be too bad because people know the minor a little bit better. But I think it's nicer to say, I'm going to give you the collection of notes from the perspective of the major as a convention, and then tell you which of those is the root or the tonic. And you could do so possibly by even writing out the chord with a capital A. So now I can remove the A that represents the note and not include any notes, and just say, look, this is an Aeolian 2 modal whole step chord, and that'll indicate that it's the tonic. Or if it's not the tonic, I can call it an A2 chord. The 2 represents 2 modal whole steps. So it's the tonic plus the distance. The distance is 2 modal whole steps. 2 times 2 would be 4 modal half steps, meaning the last note, which will land you on the Phrygian, is 4 modal half steps up from the tonic, which is the Aeolian. We can also measure it by range. So in other words, if I look at the nodal points, I could say I'm starting on the 6 or the Aeolian, and I'm going to end on the 3, which is the Phrygian. So it's a 6-3 modal range chord. And notice the 6-3 modal range chord works, again, as a naming convention for all 12 collections of 7 notes. That's why it's better, right? I can move the whole thing up this way through all 12 collections. I can then also call it an AP, or an Aeolian Phrygian modal range chord. All right, so what if we added another note? If we make a 4-note chord, which means we're going to add typically the 7 to it. I'm trying to figure out where this middle point is. If we add the 7, then that's normally called an A minor 7. Now the 7 is kind of is easier for the minors than it is for the majors, because it's always a 10-note away minor 7, whereas on the majors you've got that Mixolydian that has the minor 7, and then the rest are major 7 for the Ionian and the Lydian. So but again, this doesn't tell me then, however, if the A minor 7 is an A Aeolian minor 7, an A Dorian minor 7, or an A Phrygian. Why is that important? Because I don't know where I am on the fretboard unless I know that, right? I don't know where I am because the places are different. It's a different location on the full pattern of the fretboard. So it'd be nice to know exactly what we're talking about, and we could call it just a 4-note Aeolian chord, similar to the convention up top, where we're just going to say it's 4 chords. Just take every other note until you get 4 of them. Notice this convention is different. It's saying start on the point of the A and then keep going up until you get to the last point from a scale degree standpoint, which is the 7th. So it's giving you the starting point and the distance, how far to get to the ending point. Whereas you could use the same convention we did up here, just call it a 4-note Aeolian, or you can use this convention and say it's an Aeolian A3 modal whole step chord, but the A is redundant if you know the collection of notes you're in. So I'd rather just call it an Aeolian 3 modal whole step chord, so it's completely transposable. The 3 represents the distance to the last note. 3 times 3 is 6, plus, so that means that it's going to be 6 modal whole steps up to get to the end, which would be the 7th scale degree. Or you can measure it by distance, or by end points of the chord. meaning it's going to be a 6-5 modal range chord, meaning you start at the 6 and you go up every other note. 6, 7, there's only 7 notes. It goes around the circle to 1, and then 1, 2, 3, 3, 4, 5. You end at the 5, which means it would be an AX modal range and Aeolian Mixolydian modal range chord. You just take every other note until you get to that end point. All right, what if we added another one? We're going to say we add another note here. I'm going to see how far I can. There it is. So now it's going to be, okay, now what would we call that chord normally? An A minor 9. The 9 is equivalent in essence to the 2 from a scale degree, but this is still not telling me if we're talking about which minor mode I'm talking about, Aeolian or the Dorian. Now I'm kind of trying to think that the Dorian or the Phrygian has a flat 9, right? Yeah. So if I know my intervals, I can kind of say, well, that's got to be either the Aeolian or the Dorian. But again, it's not that specific, and most people don't know their intervals on the 9 for the 2, right? So it would be a lot more specific to tell it by nodal point, right? I'd rather say, no, look, it's a 5 note from the Aeolian node, which happens to be an A in this case. So it's a 5 note chord. Just take every other note until you grab 5 of them. And if you have to drop some in the middle, that's fine. Just make sure you grab the end points, the starting and the ending point. Or you can call it a 5 note Aeolian 4, an Aeolian A4 modal whole step, but the A is redundant. If you know the collection of notes, I'd rather call it an Aeolian 4 modal whole step chord, meaning start on the Aeolian, go a distance of 4 modal whole steps, which is 4 times 2, or 8 modal half steps, which would be the 9th scale degree, which will get you to the end point of 7, which is the Locrian node, which leads us to the other way we could say it. It's a 6-7 modal range chord. You start on the 6, take every other modal half step or each modal whole step until you get to the end point of 7. That would be 6 plus 2, 7, 1. And then 1 plus 2 is 3, 3 plus 2 is 5, 5 plus 2 is 7, meaning it's going to go Aeolian, Ionian, Phrygian, Mixolydian, Locrian. In other words, you could call it an Aeolian Locrian modal chord range. All right, let's do the next one. Here we go. All right, so now we add the 11. So now the 11 is equivalent to the 4, because from a scale degree standpoint, it goes 1. We take the 1, 3, 5. We take all the odds, 5, 6, 7, and then it goes around. It would go back to the 2, the one we skipped. But then they keep going up to the 9 is equivalent to the 2, the 11 is equivalent to the 4, the 13 is equivalent to the 6. So they're basically saying it's an A, and it's an A with a distance to the last scale degree of the 11. But again, it doesn't really tell me which it is unless you know the intervals, which does kind of trim it down a little bit, because the Phrygian would have to, you would think, still indicate that it has that flat that flat bit of the 9 in it, right? And so that's fine. So I'd rather call it an Aeolian, a 6-note Aeolian chord, meaning just take every other note until you get 6 of them, right? And then drop any ones in the middle that you can't grab because you're on a guitar. Or you can call it an Aeolian A5 modal whole step chord, but the A is redundant. If you know the collection of notes, I'd rather call it just an Aeolian 5 modal whole step chord, giving you the point that we start on plus the distance to the last point, which is 5 modal whole steps up. 5 times 2 is 10, so it would be 10 modal half steps to get to the end, which would be the 11th scale degree, which will land you on the 2 Nashville number system, otherwise known as the Dorian node, which means you can also call it a 6-2 modal range chord. Or that means you're going to start on the 6, take every other note until you get to the 2, and then stop, dropping any of those in the middle that you need to grab it on the guitar, which means it would also be an AD modal range chord, an Aeolian Dorian modal range chord. All right, what if we add another one? So we add another one. Boom, I can just delete it now. So this would be an A minor flat 13. Now this is kind of funny because now the 13 is equivalent to the 6, And you would think that you wouldn't have to do anything with this flat business on the Aeolian because it's the main minor, but we do. And that's the thing that's kind of ugly about it, right? We shouldn't have to, you would think, do anything funny if we're playing chords that are built from the notes in the 7-note collection that we are working in. But here we have to do something funny because the 13 is equivalent to the 6, and under the current naming convention, even though it says minor, the minor typically applies to the intervals up to like the 7, I think, right? It doesn't include the 9, the 11, and 13, I think is the general idea. So the 13 is equivalent to the 6, and you have a minor 6, so you had to flat the 6, which is weird. The Dorian actually is the one that works out better, which is weird. But there it is. It would be a lot easier to call it just a 7-note Aeolian. Just take every other note until you get 7 of them from the standpoint of the Aeolian. Or distance-wise, an Aeolian A6 if you need to say the A, which is redundant. Otherwise, it's just an Aeolian 6 modal whole step if you know the collection of notes you're on. And 6 times 2 is 12 modal half steps from the Aeolian point, which would be 13 scale degree, landing you on the 4 Nashville number system, which is the Lydian. So that means that you're going to go Aeolian, Ionian, Phrygian, Mixolydian, Locrian, Dorian, and then the Lydian, or from a Nashville number system 2, 1, 3, 5, 7, 2, 4. So it's going to be an AY modal range, Aeolian, Lydian modal range chord. All right, let's take a quick look at the distances for building a chord, which is the distances for the intervals, in essence, of an Aeolian scale, which means that if you go 0 modal half steps up, which would be the first scale degree, it would be 0 notes up, or otherwise known as a perfect first for the interval name, or a 0 note away from the Aeolian node, 0 modal half step from a nodal distance name. If you go 2 modal half steps up, which is 3 third scale degree, it would be 3 notes up, or 3 note away minor third, or a 3 note away from the Aeolian node second modal half step up. If you go 4 modal half steps up, which would be the 5th scale degree, it would be 7 notes up, otherwise known as a 7 note away perfect 5th, or 7 note away from the Aeolian node 4th modal half step. If you go 6 modal half steps up, it would be the 7th scale degree, which would be 10 notes away, which we know is a 10 note away minor 7, or 10 note away from the Aeolian node 6 modal half steps up. If you go 8 modal half steps up, or the 9th scale degree, it would be 2 distance-wise from a local distance, or 2 times 12 to add the octave, 14 away, which would be a 2 note away major second, or a major 9 if we had the octave. And that would be a 2 note away from the Aeolian node 8 modal half step. If we go 10 modal half steps up, which would be the 11th scale degree, it would be 5 notes up, or 5 plus 12, which would be a 5 note away perfect 4th, or a perfect 11th if we add the octave for our scale intervals. If we go 12 modal half steps up, or the 13th scale degree, it would be 8 notes up, or 8 plus 12, that would be an 8 note away minor 6, or minor 13, 8 note away from the Aeolian 12 modal half steps. These are the notes from the perspective of the collection of notes around the C major or A minor. If we put these into a bucket, then the minor, you would think, would fit nicely into the minor bucket, but it doesn't, because when you add that last one, the 13 interval, then you have to put it over here, because again, that 13 has a minor 13, which you would think would fit into the minor bucket, but it doesn't, because of the weirdness of the way they had to construct this thing. So let's go to the Dorian. Let's repeat the process. The Dorian, see if we can go through this a little faster, because we're going to have to go Locrian as well on this one. So if we go Dorian, if we have a normal triad for a Dorian, I'm just going to call it D minor. That doesn't stand for Dorian. That's just the D that happens to be the related Dorian from the perspective of the C. And again, the minor doesn't tell me if it's Aeolian, Dorian, or Phrygian. It doesn't tell me where I am in the pattern. It would be nicer to say that we're in the collection of notes around the C major, but we're playing the Dorian chord, and then to call it a D, like a 3-note Dorian chord. That means it's just a triad that's a Dorian. You just take every other note from the Dorian node. Or you can call it a DD2 or a Dorian D2 if you don't know the collection of notes and you need to list out or tell someone the actual note name. But you could tell people that you are in the Dorian key, which most people will do if the Dorian is the tonic. But I think it's nicer, once again, to say, hey, look, we're in the collection of notes around the key of C, and then we're going to be playing the Dorian chord, which, if it's the tonic, the center point, I can capitalize it. Just call it a capital D2. That D not standing for Dorian, not standing for the D note, but for the Dorian. So I've removed all note names from my naming convention and just told people the collection of notes that I'm in based on the major scale, and then what the tonic is by capitalizing the D in the chord there. And that makes it all completely transferable, transposable. If it's not the tonic, you can call it just a lowercase D2 chord, 2 representing 2 modal whole steps up from the tonic, meaning 4 modal half steps, meaning start on the Dorian and you're going to end on the Aeolian, because the Dorian is 2 plus 2 is 4 plus 2 is 6. Okay, so that means that I could call it then a modal range chord, a 2-6 modal range chord, or I can call it a DA modal range chord, D Dorian to the Lydian to the Aeolian. All right, let's add another one. Okay, so we're going to say, okay, so now we're going to say, what if we add another note? We call that a D minor 7. So again, the minor 7 is the same, so I wouldn't know if that's a D minor that is the D. Does the D represent the node of the Dorian node, the node of the Phrygian node, the node of the Aeolian? I don't know. I just know I'm on the D, but I don't know where the D lands in the collection of notes that I'm currently in. It doesn't tell me the continent that I'm on from our 7-note continent analogy, because I don't know the perspective of where the world is turning, how the thing is spinning, right? So it'd be nicer to say, hey, look, it's a 4-note Dorian chord, to just take every other node from the Dorian until you get 4 of them, or a Dorian D3 chord. But that's redundant. If you know the collection of notes, it would be better to say it's just a Dorian 3 modal whole step chord. Start on the Dorian, go 3 modal whole steps up. 3 times 2 is 6 modal half steps, which would be the 7th scale degree, which will land you on, it goes 2 to 4 to 6 to 1. It's landing you on the Ionian, meaning you can also express it with a modal range. A 2-1 modal range chord, meaning 2, 4, 6, and then stop on the 1. Or you can call it a DI modal range chord, which would be Dorian, Lydian, Aeolian, and Ionian. So you can actually list out the chord by the Nashville number systems specifically, all of them, not just the endpoints, right? And then and that's for all 12 collections of notes. It'll be the same. So let's do the next one. So what if we have then another one? It's going to be a D minor 9. So now we have a minor 9. So again, it doesn't tell me where I'm starting from. It's a D, but I don't know which node, which continent from our continent analogy, which of the 7 continents I'm on here. So I can kind of know that it's possibly not the Phrygian, because the Phrygian's going to have like a flat 9. So it's got to be the Aeolian or it's got to be the Aeolian or the Dorian. But still, most people don't know that. Right? It would be nice to tell them it's a 5-note Dorian, or it's a Dorian D4, but the D is redundant. You could say it's a Dorian 4 modal whole step chord, meaning start on the Dorian, the last note is 4 modal whole steps up, or 4 times 2 is 8 modal half steps up, which would be 9 scale degree, which would be the 3 Nashville number system, which is the Phrygian. Or from a range standpoint, it'd be a 2-3 modal range. Start on the 2, take every other note, 2, 4, 6, and then it goes around the horn to 1, 3. That would be a DP, or Dorian Phrygian modal range, DP modal range chord. All right, what if we add another? Add another one. Not just like the other one, but it's going to be a Dorian minor 11 chord now. So remember, the 11 is equivalent from a scale degree standpoint to the 4 that we skipped. right? So again, I don't know the Dorian. The D here stands for the D note. I don't know where the starting point is from a continent perspective, really, just by that. It's not just that I don't know because I don't understand. It's that I don't know because if you just give me the note name and I have no other context, then I don't know. I don't know where the D lies in the collection of notes we're in. And I know that you could say, well, what you have to do is you have to list out all the notes in the alphabet and then figure out what the sharps and flats are so that you can properly map it out. But again, that system is not, that's not the optimal system to be using. It just isn't. Like, I mean, I get it's on the piano and on the score, but I mean, it'd be nicer to say, particularly on like a guitar, to say it's going to be a 6-note Dorian chord, meaning just take every other note until you get 6 of them, or to say it's a D5 or a Dorian D5, but the D is redundant. Better just call it a Dorian 5, meaning start on the Dorian, go 5 modal whole steps up, which would be 5 times 10, or 10 modal half steps up, which will be 11 scale degree. That'll get you to the 5 Nashville number system, otherwise known as the Mixolydian. You could list it by range. It would be a 2-5 modal range chord. Start on the 2, take every other modal half step until you get to the 5, which will get you to a DX, Dorian Mixolydian. Dorian Mixolydian range chord is another name that would be nice. What if you add the 13? Then we can call that a D minor 13. Notice that the Dorian, that D stands for the D note, not the Dorian, but it happens to be on the Dorian node, is a funny one because they actually work all the way down for the Dorian. The Dorian looks like what you would expect from the Aeolian. You don't have to do anything funny. The Aeolian, you will recall, had this funny one. That's why it's yellow. I had to do a flat 13. The Dorian doesn't need to do that because it has a 13 that's actually closer to, that is a major 13, right? Which is a major 9, major 13. That's the interval that's different on the Dorian than the Aeolian, which you would think would mean that you'd have to do something funny on the Dorian because the Aeolian would be the default, but it's reversed for some weird reason that you have to do something funny with the Aeolian, but the Dorian is the one that works out fine. What is going on with, like, why did you make it like this? But I mean, it'd be better. I could just call it a 7-note Dorian. You just take every other note until you get 7 of them and then just drop the ones in the middle possibly, or a Dorian D6 modal whole step chord. The D would be redundant if you know the collection of notes. I'd rather just call it a Dorian 6 modal whole step chord. 6 times 2 would be 12, which would be the 13th scale degree. If you go that distance, you'll land on the 7 Nashville number system, which is the Locrian, which you could call a DN modal range chord, a Dorian Locrian modal range chord. Let's look at the intervals. So if I went 0 modal whole steps up on the Dorian, which would be the first scale degree, it's going to be 0 notes up. If I go 2 modal whole steps up, which would be the 3rd scale degree, I get 3 notes up, which is going to be a 3 note away minor 3rd. The first one was a perfect first. If I go 4 modal half steps up, it would be the 5th scale degree. It would be 7 notes up, 7 note away perfect 5th. Or it would be a 7 note away from the Dorian node, 4th modal half step. The last one was a 3 note away from the Dorian node, 2 modal half step. If I go, 4, if I think I did that one, 6 modal half steps up, it would be the 7th scale degree. It would be 10 notes up, which we know is the 10 note away minor 7. All of them have a 10 note away minor 7 on the Dorian side. I mean, on the minor side, that being the Dorian mode, the Aeolian mode, the Phrygian mode, and the major mode of the Mixolydian has that minor 7. So the 11 note away major 7 only really happens on the Ionian and on the Lydian. A lot of people don't play in Lydian because it has a crazy 6 note away distance like the Locrian, but it's on the 4 instead of the 5. So whatevers. Anyways, it's a 10 note away from the Dorian, 6 modal half step. If we go 8 modal half steps up or 9 scale degree, it's going to be 2 notes up, or 2 plus 12 notes up if we take the octave into account. That's a 2 note away major 2nd or major 9. We could call it a 2 note away from the Dorian, 8 modal half steps up. If we go 10 modal half steps up, 11th scale degree, it would be 5 notes up, or 5 plus 12 for the octave. That would be a 5 note away perfect 4th or perfect 11th, which would be a 5 note away from the Dorian node, 10 modal half steps. If we go 12 modal half steps up, which would be 13 scale degree, that would be 9 notes up, or 9 plus 12, which would be a 9 note away major 6 or major 13, which would be a 9 note away from the Dorian node, 12 modal half steps. These would be the notes from the perspective of the collection of notes around the C major or the D Dorian, however you want to name it, noting again that the Dorian falls beautifully all into the minors. So all of the notes that I can grab from the point or vantage point of the Dorian will fit into our current naming convention, which is weird because again the Aeolian didn't even fit in the current naming without this weird extension. Okay. Let's go to the Phrygian now. Let's go to the Phrygian. Phrygian. Wait, what happened to... No, I went too far down. You've gone too far. You've gone too far. What have you done? I can go back. Okay. Phrygian. So if I start on the Phrygian, the related Phrygian would be an F minor. So again, the F minor is just a minor extension. If I just say F minor with no context, I don't know what node you're talking about. Is it the Dorian Phrygian? Is it the Phrygian minor? Is it the Dorian node that I'm on? Is it the Aeolian node? I don't really know. I would expect it to be one of those threes unless I'm doing something funny. I could be doing something funny some other place. But that would be my general assumption, and so I'd rather call it just a 3-note Phrygian, or you can call it a Phrygian F2, but the F would be redundant if you know the collection of notes that you're in. Now, if you want to make the Phrygian the tonic, you could capitalize it, just call it a capital P. The reason I'm using a capital P2. Now, note again, you could, if you're playing in Phrygian, you could just say, I'm looking at the 7-note collection of notes, I'm playing in F Phrygian. But I still think the convention, like with the Nashville number system, would be nice to say, look, I'm in the collection of notes around the C major, and I'm making the tonic the 2, which is the Phrygian. I'm playing around the 2, and you can indicate that by just writing the name of the chord when you go there, with a capital Phrygian, a capital P2. So that would be a nice convention to have if we have this ability to capitalize. But you could just say we're playing in Phrygian, which means people would have to then derive the collection of notes by applying the formula or backing into the major from the Phrygian and whatnot, which again is not a lot of people aren't as good at doing that. But in any case, it would be a Phrygian 2 chord, meaning it's going to be 2 modal whole steps up from the Phrygian node, or 4 modal half steps up, which would get you to the 7 from a scale degree point, which would be 7 from the Nashville number system, which would be the Locrian. So then we can call that a 3-7 modal range chord, or a PN modal range chord, Phrygian Locrian modal range chord, meaning it's going to be a 3 plus 2 is 5 plus 2 is 7, which would be the Phrygian Mixolydian Locrian. I can name it very specifically by just the nodes that are in it. All right, let's do the next one. If we add another note to Phrygian, que paso, que pasarando. What's going to happen? Que pasará, que pasará. It's going to be an F minor 7. So again, the minor 7 is the same distance for all of the minor modes. So it doesn't really tell me if it's on the Dorian, the Phrygian, or the Dorian, or the Phrygian, or the Aeolian. So it'd be nicer to call it a 4-note Phrygian, or a Phrygian F3 if we don't know the collection of notes. But if we know the collection of notes we're in, just call it a Phrygian 3 modal whole step chord, giving you the point of the Phrygian, and then go to the last note, which has a distance of 3 modal whole steps, which is 3 times 2, or 6 modal half steps, which would be the 7th scale degree, providing you an end point of Nashville number system 2, which we call the Dorian node. So it would be a 3-5-7-2 chord, or a Phrygian Mixolydian Locrian Dorian chord, which you can name by the end points, which would be a 3-2 modal range chord, or a Phrygian Dorian modal range chord. Otra vez. So let's do the next one. And this one, if you add the 9, it would be an F minor flat 9. Now that's because on the Phrygian, the 9 is the interval that is different, remembering that the 9 is equivalent to the 2 because it goes 1, 3, 5, 7, and then 9 is equivalent to the 2 because there's only 7 scale degrees. And the Phrygian has that crazy minor second, which is right next to it. So it's the half step away. So that's what makes it different. So that means it's going to mess up all of the rest of the chords from the normal convention, forcing us to do this flat kind of thing because of that interval distance from this point going forward. So we have an ugly kind of chord, which we shouldn't have for any of the chords that are normal to the 7-note collection. And I don't know what, so I'd rather call it a 4-note Phrygian chord, or a Phrygian F4 modal whole step chord if I don't know the collection of notes, but the F is redundant if I do, meaning it would be nice to just call it a Phrygian 4 modal half step chord, meaning start on the Phrygian and then keep going every other modal half step, which is every modal whole step, until you get 4 modal whole steps up. 4 times 2 is 8. 8 plus 1 would be the 9th scale degree. That's going to get you to the Nashville number point of 4, which is the Lydian. So in other words, it's going to be a 3-4 modal range chord, or a Phrygian Lydian modal range chord. Just take every other note until you get to that end point. Okay, let's do the next one. We know how it works. We know how it works, kind of. Let's just see the next one. So now we're going to go, the next one, it would be an F minor 11 flat 9. So notice that the 11 is equivalent to the 4 from a local distance of the scale degree, and it has a normal 11 because it's a perfect fourth, which is typical of most that's a typical distance. But then we had to tack on the flat 9 because we're assuming under the normal convention that the 9 is going to be a major 9, even though it says minor, because the convention is that when I say minor, it doesn't mean the 9 isn't included in that. You just have to know that. Didn't you know that? But it would be better, like if I knew this convention, I can at least know that that's not going to be like the Dorian mode or the Aeolian, because they don't have a flat 9. But most people don't really know that, and you're still not naming the chord. So even though that's very specific and it tells you the node that you're on, it doesn't even tell you exactly what the node you're on specifically. It'd be better if you named the node you're on by calling it a 6-note Phrygian, or you can call it a Phrygian F5 if you don't know the note, but if you don't know the collection of notes. But if you know the collection of notes, you know where that the F is the Phrygian, because it's in the relative position for the continents that you're working in. So it could just be called a Phrygian 5 modal whole step chord, meaning start on the Phrygian, take every other modal half step until you get 5 modal whole steps up, which was 5 times 10, or 5 times 2 is 10 modal half steps up, which would be the 11th scale degree, which would mean that you're on the 6th Nashville number system, which is the Aeolian node, which means you can call it a 3-6 modal range chord, or a Phrygian Aeolian modal range chord. Okay, what if we add the 13? Then it would be an F minor flat 13 flat 9. Again, that's really ugly. Why is that? Because the 13 is equivalent to the 6. And again, with the Phrygian, you have and so the 6 needs to be flattened to get a minor 6, which you would expect most of them have minor 6s, right? It's only the Dorian that doesn't have a minor 6, because you're in the minor mode. But even though it says minor, it doesn't apply to the 13, which is equivalent to the 6. So you still have to flat it, and it doesn't apply to the 9, which is equivalent to the 2. So it needs to be flatted, meaning you're going to make it like a minor distance, even though it says minor, because the minor thing that you said right here only applies to it doesn't apply to the ones after the 9, 11, and 13. So again, you can kind of see, if I know the convention, I could see that, and we'll say, well, that can't be the Aeolian or the Dorian. It's got to be the Phrygian. But it doesn't actually tell you the node that you're in, and it's really ugly. Like, it'd be a lot better if you just said it's a 7-note Phrygian, meaning just take every other note And if you have to drop some in the middle, that's cool. Just pick up the first and the end, and we'll still call it a 7-note Phrygian, right? Or you can call it a Phrygian F6 modal whole step chord if you don't know the collection of notes. But if you do, you can just call it a Phrygian 6 modal whole step chord, meaning start on the Phrygian and go 6 modal whole steps up, taking every other modal half step as you get there. 6 times 2 would be 12 modal half steps up, which would be the 13th scale degree, which will land you on the 1 Nashville number system, which is the Ionian node. So that means you can call it a Phrygian Ionian modal range chord, or a 3-1 modal range chord. Okay, makes perfect sense. Let's go over the intervals real quick. If you go 0 notes, 0 modal whole half steps up, it would be the first scale degree, which would be 0 notes up. Perfect first, 0 notes away from the Phrygian node, 0 modal half steps. If you go 2 modal half steps up, it would be third scale degree. It would be 3 notes up, or 3 note away minor third, which would be a 3 note away from the Phrygian node, second modal half step. If you go 4 modal half steps up, or the 5th scale degree, it would be 7 notes up, otherwise known as a 7 note away perfect 5th, or a 7 note away from the Phrygian 4th modal half step. If you go 6 modal half steps up, it would be the 7th scale degree, which has a distance of 10 notes. That's our 10 note away minor 7. All the minor modes and the major mode of Mixolydian have a 10 note away minor 7, which we can call a 10 note away from the Phrygian node 6 modal half step. If you go 8 modal half steps up, it's the 9th scale degree, which will be 1 note up, or 1 plus 12 notes up if you take account the octave, which would be a 1 note away minor 2nd, or a minor 9. If we go 10 modal half steps up, it would be the 11th scale degree, 5 notes up, or 5 plus 12, which would be a 5 note away perfect 4th, or perfect 11, and it would be 5 notes away from the Phrygian, 5 notes from the Phrygian 10 modal half steps. If we go 12 modal half steps up, it would be the 13th scale degree, or 8 notes up, or 8 plus 12 would be an 8 note away minor 6, or minor 13, which would be an 8 note away from the Phrygian node 12 modal half steps. Here are the notes from the collection of notes around the key of C, which could change automatically as we shift through all of the 12 positions and do on our Excel worksheet. You can do that. I said and do to rhyme, but you can do that. So if we map this into our buckets, then it works for the minors. So these two fit in the minor bucket here, but then it gets thrown off when you add the 9, because the 9 is equivalent to the 2. It has a flat 2, and that means all the rest of them are thrown off, and the last one has a really messy 13 and 9. So the Phrygian doesn't fit into the buckets as nice. The Dorian fits beautifully, even better than the main minor, the Aeolian, which is cool for the Dorian, but it doesn't make any sense for most people who would expect that the Aeolian would be the one that fits the best, because that's the main minor. Anyway, let's go to the Locrian. Locrian's like a minor mode, but it has a flat 5. It's kind of closer to the Phrygian, however, because it has that crazy 1 note away second. So that would be a B diminished we're going to start with. So we had to come up with a whole nother name, which we call the diminished, right? And so now, and that's because it has a flat 5. So I can't call it major. I can't call it minor because it has a flat 5. It's the only one that had to go flat 5. Nobody goes flat 5. Nobody goes flat 5. But no, they did it. He got kicked out. They got kicked out of the club because he went flat 5. No more, not a minor anymore. Okay, so now it's a diminished. You've been diminished. That's what you get. Okay. So it's really constructed the same way though. It's a 3-note Locrian chord, and I'm calling it an N for Locrian because I'm going to say it's reversed or crazy, so we don't have to use an L because the L looks like a 1. So it's a 3-note Locrian chord, and you build it the same way. Just start on the Locrian, take every other note. There's only 7 of them, so you start over at 1, 7, 1, 2, 2, 3, 4. So it's a Locrian, Dorian, Lydian. You construct it the same way from the collection of 7 notes. It just so happens that the distance from the Locrian to the Lydian is no longer 7 away, but 6, which is the weird distance. But easy to build if you think about it this way, right? Or you can call it a Locrian B2 chord. And by the way, if you say it's a B diminished, you're pretty confident that that's the Locrian mode if it's working in your normal collection of notes. So anytime you say, oh, it's a diminished, well, you're going to think, okay, well, yeah, that means it's going to be built off of that. That's at least specific, as opposed to the major and minors where I don't know which node it's on. But it still would be nice to just name it by the node that you're on. Why? Because that's transposable through all 12 collections of 7 notes. And by the way, 7 notes plus the oceans, you can add the ocean notes. I'm just saying the main continent notes are 7. So we have a 2 note, so you could call it a Locrian B2. If you were playing in Locrian, you could indicate that it's the tonic. Now, normally people do not play in the Locrian mode, but it's possible, and the similar convention would happen whenever you go to a Locrian chord. You're looking at it from the perspective of the Locrian. But if it was the tonic, you could say, hey, look, I'm playing in B Locrian. But again, that's not really nice to do because people would have to derive the Locrian using the formula from the Locrian or try to find the related major to figure it out. What's the nice thing to do? The thing the Nashville number system people do, which is to derive the collection of 7 notes applying to the related major formula. In this case, I'm in the collection of notes around the C major, and we're going to make the Locrian the tonic, which we could indicate by capitalizing the chord. So instead of calling it a lowercase N2 modal whole step, it's an uppercase N2 modal whole step. I think that's a nice convention that just is an extension of what the Nashville number system is basically doing, right? So you're on the Locrian, you're going 2 modal whole steps up from there to get to the end point. So that's gonna be 4 modal half steps, or the 5th scale degree, which will land you on Nashville number 4, which will be the Lydian. In other words, it's going to be a 7-2-4 chord, or a Locrian Dorian Lydian chord, or the endpoints a 7-4 modal range chord, or an NY Locrian Lydian modal range chord. What if I go down to the next one? I don't know what if. Let's try it and see what happens. Try it and see what happens. It would be a Locrian half diminished. That's the symbol for half diminished. Now, the Locrian gets messed up. The Locrian is a complete mess from a normal naming convention standpoint, because again, you remember how this kind of happened. They constructed the major and then the minor, and then they kind of built everything else into it. And the Locrian is such a mess because it has that flat 5 that they had to, in essence, just kind of make its own convention, as we did with the Mixolydian. You'll recall that the Mixolydian up here just gave up after the 7 because that's the interval that was a flat 7, and it came up quickly, right? It came up on the next one down. So you have a normal major, and then it had to go this other convention to indicate that you have a flat 7 all the way down. Similarly here, the diminished is already ugly, but then they had to do a half diminished because of I won't get into the technicalities, but the general, from a logistics standpoint, the easiest way to say it, I believe, is to have a diminished, and then if you add anything else to it, you call it a half diminished. So again, I know if you say it's a B, it doesn't tell you that it's the Locrian node, but the fact that it's a half diminished kind of is a strong indicator that yes, that's probably the Locrian node. But it would be nicer if you named it. So name it by the node. So that would be a 4-note Locrian chord, same construction. You just start on the Locrian, and then you take every other modal half step until you get 4 notes. Or you can call it a Locrian B3 chord, 3 modal half steps, if you don't know the collection of notes you're in. If you do, I'd rather call it just a Locrian 3 modal whole step chord, because that gives you the point, Locrian, distance, 3 modal whole steps to get to the last note, which would be 3 times 2 or 6 modal half steps, which would be the 7th scale degree, which is going to land you on Nashville number system 6, which is the Aeolian node. So that means that the range could be a 7-6 modal range chord, 7-6 modal range chord, or an NA modal range chord, Locrian Aeolian modal range chord. All right, let's do the next one. These are going to be similar all the way down. We've got the pattern now. The pattern has been established. So now we're going to add the 9, but we had to do the same convention and just call it a B half diminished 9. So again, that fits, right? So we're, in essence, we're just going to apply that half diminished to all of the intervals for the Locrian after the normal triad, which is a diminished, right? So, but I'd rather name the node, so I'd rather call it a five note Locrian, or a Locrian B4. If you don't know the collection of notes, it would be nicer to say it's just a Locrian 4 modal whole step chord, meaning you go from the Locrian node 4 modal whole steps up, which was 4 times 2, or 8 modal half steps up, which would be the 9th scale degree, landing you on Nashville number system 1, which would be the Ionian node, which means you can call it a 7-1 modal range chord, 7-1 modal range chord, or an NI modal range chord, otherwise known as a Locrian Ionian modal range chord. All right, let's do the next one and say next one. So now we're going to say that the next one is just going to be a B half diminished. It should be 11. Something got messed up here. It should be 11. Typo, but okay. But it's just the same convention. I'd rather call it a 6-note Locrian, or a Locrian B5 modal whole step chord. The B is redundant. If you know the collection of notes, it would be nice to just call it a Locrian 5 modal whole step chord, giving you the point that you're on. Take every other note or modal half step until you get 5 modal whole steps up. 5 times 2 is 10 modal half steps up, or the 11th scale degree, which will get you to the 3 Nashville number system, or the Phrygian, meaning it could be a 7-3 modal range chord, 7-3 modal range chord, or an NP modal range chord, otherwise known as a Locrian Phrygian modal range chord. Finally, we have a B half diminished 13. 13 is the equivalent to the 6, but the same convention here applies, but I'd rather call it a 7-note Locrian chord, or a Locrian B6 modal whole step chord if I don't know the collection of notes. If I do, shorten it up to the Locrian 6 modal whole step chord, meaning take every other modal half step until you get 6 modal whole steps up from the Locrian node. 6 times 2 is 12 modal half steps, which is the 13th scale degree, which will land you on Nashville number system 5, which is Mixolydian. Therefore, you can call it a 7-5 modal range chord, or a Locrian to the Mixolydian modal range chord, NX modal range chord. Let's do the intervals real quick. We're running long on time. So if I go 0 modal half steps up for the Locrian, which would be 1 scale degree, first scale degree, 0 notes up, which is a perfect first, or 0 note away from the Locrian node, 0 modal half steps. If I go 2 modal half steps up, which is the 3rd scale degree, it would be 3 notes up, which is a 3 note away minor third, the same for the minor modes. Or it would be a 3 note away from the Locrian node, 2 modal half steps up. If I go 4 modal half steps up, it would be the 5th scale degree, which would be 6 notes up. Here's the crazy distance. That anytime you see 6 in notes, that's a crazy distance. So it's a 6 note away flat 5. That's the thing that makes it crazy. 6 note away diminished 5th, which would, you can call a 6 note away from the Locrian node, 4th modal half step. No one else has that flat 5, although the Lydian does have the 6-note distance, but it's on the 4th scale degree, or the 3rd modal half step up. So if I go 6 modal half steps up, it would be the 7th scale degree, 10 notes up, which is our 10 note away minor 7. That's the distance that we find in all of the minor modes, as well as the Mixolydian. So there's only 2 modes that don't have a 10 note away minor 7, which we can call a 10 note away from the Locrian node, 6 modal half steps. If I go 8 modal half steps up, it would be 1 note up, or 1 plus 12. If we take an octave into consideration, which would be a 1 note away minor 2nd, or minor 9, which would be a 1 note away from the Locrian 8 modal half steps. If we go 10 modal half steps up, would be 11th scale degree. It would be 5 notes up. That would be a 5 note away perfect 4th, or perfect 11th, or 5 note away from the Locrian node, 10 modal half steps. If we go 12 modal half steps up, or 13th scale degree, it would be 8 notes up, or 8 plus 12. If we have the octave, that would be an 8 note away minor 6, or minor 13, 8 note away from the Locrian node, 12 modal half steps. These are the notes for the collection of notes around the key of C, but they can easily be changed in our worksheet here that if you want to check out for all of the for all 12 collections of 7 notes. And we had to create this extra bucket now just for the Locrian mode. 2 extra buckets because the diminished lands in this bucket, and then we had to create the half diminished to pick up all these buckets. So this is the buckets then. These are the 3 majors, Ionian, and then the Lydian. You have these deviations over here to map out the Lydian, the collection of notes built from the perspective of the Lydian node. And then the Mixolydian, you had to build these buckets in order to work in the Mixolydian into the system. Aeolian, you would think would all fit on the minors, but no, you had to have this extension in order to make it work. And then the Dorian actually works beautifully, all fits into the minors, although you wouldn't expect that if you were just intuitively thinking, considering the Aeolian is the main minor. And then the Phrygian gets messed up when you get to the 2, which is the 9 from a chord construction, and therefore it makes extensions after that point over here. And then the Locrian, we had to add 2 extra entire buckets to deal with the fact that it's a complete mess because it has a flat 5. All right, so that's the general layout. So that means that last bit, again, would be a lot easier. It's a lot longer of a worksheet to look at, but it's a lot cleaner to look at if you're using normal naming conventions than this is, right? This doesn't tell you what nodal point you're working from. So what I would suggest, whatever naming convention you use, if you're still using the normal naming convention, then what you would like to do is still break out your playing by relative points, right? The relative scale degree points, and then break out these chord names into the buckets that look like this, so that you know exactly which chords, not just major or minor, which has a major or minor third to it, but also when you add the added extensions, you can add them with more confidence knowing the chord names. Now note that these are just the chord names from chords that don't include anything that's in the ocean, meaning they're all built from the 7 notes in the 7-note collection, not including any of the 5 notes that we're saying is out of the collection that we're calling the ocean notes in essence. So we could have chords, of course, that do add those in there. And if that's the case, then of course we want to have a naming convention to add those in as well, which means from a normal standpoint, the extensions are going to get uglier. You would expect extensions happening over here, or from our modal point of view, then we're all going to have to add some things to it as well. So that's what we'll talk about later.